guess the first thing I want to say about this show is that everything that you're seeing here, one of the important things I think to know for the viewer is that it all comes from the same comic book. It's from an old Iron Man comic book, Iron Man 178. It was published in the early 80s. And for the last maybe 7 or 8 years now, I've been working on trying to deconstruct this comic book in various ways. So this show is like the last 2 years of work that I've been making from this comic book. So, one of the things that I wanted to do when I started this body of work was to try to talk about comics in a way, hopefully in a way that most people or a lot of contemporary artists weren't talking about comics. So I wanted to get away from just the referencing the imagery and like blowing it up, And so I started to try to think about the things that artists weren't thinking about with comics. And I feel like the two things that I focused on that I felt like a lot of artists weren't was the structure of the comics, how artists actually think about putting a comic book together, and the narrative of the comic. So I could just kind of walk around and talk about some of the things that I've been thinking about. Right here are 2 examples of the breakdowns, the deconstructions that I've been doing of the entire comic book. One of the things that really interests me as an artist is this idea of taking something that's very known and concrete and trying to show it to you in a different way, to sort of challenge your assumptions maybe you have about that idea or that image. So with this example, I've removed all of the sort of standard things about any kind of a comic book imagery. So the figures, the text, background imagery, and I just sort of have these dominant background colors, which I think talks about in the structure of the comics, when someone's coloring a comic, I guess they don't have to think about that anymore since everything is printed digitally, but in the 80s and previously, these were all printed offset, so cost was an issue. So the colorist had to actually think about how many colors they were using, and so when they had a blue, they thought about, all right, where else can I use that blue? And so you can see these patterns start to emerge on pages, and you can see these color relationships start to emerge from page to page. Originally when I did this, it was just the colors, and I liked this idea of creating something very abstract, again, from something that seems very direct, has a narrative point to it. But just on kind of a whim, I added the blank talk bubbles, and I really liked the rhythm that created, and again, I think it kind of gives you an idea about the pacing of the story. I did another version of this that's black and white, where it's just the frames and black talk bubbles. And with that, and I think with this, one of the other things I think you can get a sense of, that I was kind of alluding to previously, is that idea of the story and the pacing of the story. So this comic book, it's an old comic book. It's a comic book that I've read. I remember reading it when I was a kid. And it's a really weird comic book. Number one, even though it's an Iron Man comic book, the superhero Iron Man never appears in this comic. It has 2 storylines. The first 11 pages, which ends here, is a storyline about a group of neighborhood kids that dress up like their favorite superheroes, and then they take down the neighborhood bully. And then there's a middle page, which is just this random narrator that makes fun of the previous storyline and then introduces the next storyline, which is a story about Tony Stark, who is Iron Man, but he is an alcoholic at this point in time in his life, and he's homeless and he's broke. And he has a bet with a couple cops that he can not have a drink for a night. So the cops bet him $50. That he won't be able to do that. And so one of the other things about this book that I started to get drawn into was that I kind of saw this as a representation of the history of comics. This first storyline, which is kind of childish and silly, you can see that the page structure is like page structures from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, where it's much more gridded out. It's very easily readable. Not a lot of experimentation going on. The color relationships are very, they're not very dynamic, I guess is maybe the way to say that. So it's kind of a representation of, comic books before they started to become really experimental. And then the last storyline, which is more of a, if you would say adult storyline or whatever, a deeper, darker storyline, you can see that the structure of the panels in relationship to the story, they get much more creative, much more experimental. So I thought that was an interesting thing that was happening here as well. And then there's this. So this, I'm trying to see if there's any sort of relationship between the panel structure and the text. So this is a complete readout of the text that is being said on that page that is then overlapped by the panel structure from each page. So that's this series. And then and this is some of the most recent work that I've been doing. The oldest work are these CMYK silkscreens that have these images and some text. So one of the things I became interested in was this notion of sort of the assumptions that we have about who's talking, how we would interpret something that looks like a comic book but that has no characters, that has no direct sort of narrative, or it has no sort of direct directions about how we should interpret these things. So that started to give me the idea of just referencing the backgrounds and then utilizing some of the text. So in Photoshop, I just use color and lines that already exist on the page, and then I slowly redraw with Photoshop the imagery so I can fill it in, finish it off, and then it's printed in CMYK silkscreen. And then I got this idea of, again, sort of thinking about the things that we don't really think about with comics, and maybe just in imagery in general. I just started thinking about the backgrounds of things. So that gave me this idea of just eliminating everything that directly references the story in the comic. And there's that Cory Archangel piece that's Super Mario Clouds that was very sort of inspirational for me when I first saw that. So I was kind of thinking about that when I was making these pieces. And then the other most recent pieces, which is kind of the direction that I'm going to be going now, are these text pieces and then this piece. So one of the things I'm starting to get interested in is this idea of sort of taxonomies of things inside the comic. I've just been really engaged with our ideas about understanding and data and how we understand data and metrics and all these kinds of things. And so it became interesting to me to think, like, in terms of some of these issues, that you can get all of this information, but if one thing is removed, all of it can become meaningless. So for these pieces, for example, this is all of the text from the first storyline, this is all of the text in the second storyline, but it's in alphabetical order, so everything about the narrative becomes completely unknowable. So I kind of liked that idea that I can completely give you the narrative and give you the story, yet it's completely meaningless at the same time. And then the last thing, and so this is the next sort of breakdown that I'm going to be working on. So in this scale, all 23 pages, I'm going to start doing this. So this is kind of just this visual breakdown, taxonomy of all of the elements on one page of the comic book. So this is all the text in alphabetical order, all of the panels in the order, going from left to right and from top to bottom in which they appear. Same thing with all the bubbles, going from left to right, top to bottom. And then the three characters that appear on that page and all of the versions of them, again, in order in which they appear in the comic. So again, it's like you have all of the information that you need to understand the narrative, but it's completely nonsense. So that's the show.
So you've been working on this series for 5 years now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Are there any, I guess, do you have anything to say about that? And then are there any really interesting observations that you've had from this comic from looking at it for so long?
One of the things that I kind of have grown into is these long-term projects. When I was in graduate school in 2001, I started documenting my life through my receipts. I was making this kind of consumer diary. I would take all my receipts and then I would redraw them and I would print them with various handmade printing processes. And I did that for about 10 years. And that kind of overlapped with this for a while. And when I was doing that, I really liked the idea that every time I thought it was done, a new idea or a new interpretation, a new way of thinking about them would emerge, which would continue its life cycle for a little bit. And so that same thing is happening here, where in the very beginning, the work I was making, it was all black and white, and it was very formal. I was really just focusing on the bubbles as objects themselves, floating in this space of halftones. And I just liked this idea of, again, taking something that has a visual narrative to it, but making it abstract, making it formal. So it's taken on a lot of these different iterations over the years, and I just seem to be very drawn to that process. I know a lot of artists, and I have a lot of students who, after like a month, they get sick of an idea. But I like the challenge that after the obvious things were done, and I was faced with quitting or moving on, I like that idea that these started to become more complex as time has gone by, and it's forced me to kind of think of sort of deeper things about this book. So as the years have gone by, this as being the sort of metaphor for the history of comics is something that was very recent to me. I was giving a talk at this conference in New Orleans when it kind of dawned on me I was including comic book history in this talk. And I was talking about this series, and when I was working on the lecture, that's when I realized there were these correlations between the two. So that was one big surprise that happened. But at the same time, there's been other surprises in other ways. I curated a show of different artists from around the country that was at a gallery in Pittsburgh. And I gave each artist a high-resolution digital version of each page. And I told them, you can just do whatever you want with this, but it'll be on paper, and give it to me and I'll show it. And from there were some interesting things that happened. Like a great example of this is that in one of these panels, I think it was in this page, the artist, he was a printmaker at the University of Kansas. The piece he sent me was a t-shirt that he made. And it was a t-shirt with Snoopy on it. And I got this and I was just like, what on earth is this? And why are you giving this to me? So then I called him up and I was like, what's going on here? And so what he pointed out to me, which I never noticed in, however many years of reading this, that in the street scene, there was a kid, and the kid's shirt was a Snoopy shirt. And he really thought it was interesting that you have these comic book artists that are referencing comics in there.
Yeah.
So there were things like that happened too, where, because I was giving it to somebody else who had never seen this before, they were noticing things that I never noticed because I was too busy, focusing on the things that I'm focused on.
Yeah.
That was a great experience for a lot of those kinds of reasons. Yeah. Yeah.
So you mentioned that with, for instance, those by removing the images, or with these by removing the images and just having the words, that it turns the narrative into nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
But do you ever consider how you're maybe rewriting or retelling the comic in that way?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing, right? And I don't know if this is going to answer your question or not, but it makes me think about the way I've been thinking about this lately, again through the sort of lens of the way that we understand things, is that, as people, when we usually try to understand something, we are presented with it fully first, and then we try to pick it apart and make sense of it. And then through picking it apart, we try to make a narrative or stories about how this explains this, right? I think cancer is a great example. We are just presented with cancer, and then we have to try to pick it apart to understand all of the different aspects of it. So I think about that the same way, like you're presented with a full comic book, but I'm trying to piece it apart. So yeah, I mean, I think that you could make a case for that idea that maybe, you know, it's presenting a new way of understanding this story through, you know, jumbling it up and creating new ways of looking at it. But some of these things are so new, it's something that I've just been kind of thinking with and maybe coming to terms with, you know.
Any other questions for Joe?
Does that page match any of these? Does that page that's like sort of a composite of everything match any of these pages? Is that?
Yeah, so this is, let's see, it's the one where it's up back. So I think it's this page here, and then it would be this page here. And I don't know if there's any of that in any of the other sort of single frames. Yeah, I don't think so. But yeah, those are the three references to that page.
Are you interested in other comics or just Iron Man?
Well, I'm interested in other comics in general. You know, I'm really, so I live close to Pittsburgh, and Pittsburgh's got a really good independent scene. I teach a mini comics class at West Virginia University, so I'm really interested in a lot of independent comics. But in terms of this, I'm really just interested in trying to find as many ways to pick this one book apart, you know. So it might go on for another, I mean, this is going to be at least another year of work to get that done, and then we'll see where it goes from there.
Well, great.
I'm just curious, you have all this information about that one comic, but the one comic isn't here though. Was that a purpose choice?
It is, because so I think one of the differences between like my breaking the comic apart and knowing where all this stuff comes from and then what I want the viewer to consider are like two different things. Like I want the viewer to come into this confused in a way. I don't want them to have something to reference, because what I like about this is hopefully the work's ability to make somebody question their own ideas about what this story is or what they think about comics. And I feel like if I had the comic as a reference point in a show, I feel like it would be too easy for the viewer to understand, and it would be too much of a direct reference. Yeah.
All right, let's have a hand for Jack.